Hello, everyone. When I think about the story of us, the story of how we came to be here, I imagine it like a giant adventure book. At the beginning, we were wanderers. We walked under open skies, following rivers, chasing food, and learning from the stars above us. We were curious, always asking, "What's next?" And then something magical happened. We learned to settle down. We discovered that tiny seeds, when cared for, could grow into fields of food. We realized fire could keep us warm, and clay could become pots. We didn't just survive anymore, we started to build. Villages grew, then towns, and before long, whole civilizations blossomed. Civilizations meant more than houses and walls. They meant stories, music, paintings on cave walls turning into written words on tablets and scrolls. They meant trade, where people swapped ideas as well as goods. They meant laws, where we tried to live fairly together. And they meant dreams, huge dreams that lifted pyramids into the sky, carved temples out of stone, and lit up libraries with knowledge. But to me, the most beautiful part is not the inventions or the monuments. It's the fact that together we never stopped imagining. Every step from the wheel to the compass, from numbers to poems, was powered by the same spark, the need to create, to connect, to reach for something greater. Today, when I look around, I see that same spark alive in us. Civilizations may look different now, with skyscrapers and smartphones, but the heart of the story is the same. It's about people coming together, building more than they could alone, and passing the torch of knowledge and hope to the next generation. So the rise of man is not just history, it's a story still being written by me, by you, by all of us. And I can't wait to see the next chapter. Thank you. When I try to imagine the earliest days of people like us, I see small groups moving across wide open lands. The ground was rough under their feet, and the air was filled with the sounds of animals, rivers, and winds. Every day was a journey, because nothing stayed in one place for long. Food was found by searching, by chasing animals, by gathering fruits and roots, by watching the patterns of the seasons and hoping the land would give enough. They carried little with them, only what they could hold or tie together, because everything else had to be left behind when it was time to move again. Life was always changing, like the sky above them, and they learned to follow the signs of nature in order to survive. These wanderers were not just walking without purpose. They were explorers. Each step into new valleys or along rivers was a step into the unknown, and curiosity was always their companion. They noticed where the sun rose and set, where herds of animals traveled, and where plants grew after rains. They learned which fruits were safe, which herbs could heal, and which paths would bring them to fresh water. Every person, even children, had to know these lessons, because forgetting meant danger. Life was hard, but it was also full of discoveries, because the world was wide and full of secrets waiting to be understood. Moving from place to place shaped the way they lived together. Families and small groups shared everything because survival depended on it. Food caught by one person was food for all. Fire built by one pair of hands warmed everyone. The bonds between them grew strong because they needed one another in ways that were impossible to ignore. Stories were told at night by the fire, not written down but spoken, remembered, and passed on. These stories carried knowledge of hunting, of seasons, of dangers, but they also carried dreams and imagination. The wandering life taught people to value memory, because memory was their library, their teacher, and their guide. But the wandering life also brought risks. If animals moved away, hunger followed. If the weather changed, whole groups had to leave their shelters and walk great distances again. Babies and elders were carried, and sometimes the journey was too hard. Storms, cold, and sickness were constant threats. There was never complete safety, never a guarantee that tomorrow would be easier than today. And still, step by step, they continued because moving was the only way to find what they needed. Then slowly, through watching and learning, something began to change. People noticed that seeds dropped into the earth grew into plants again. They noticed that animals could be followed and even kept close instead of only hunted. This was not a sudden discovery, but many small ones repeated over time. These ideas grew like the plants themselves, quietly but powerfully, and they began to change the rhythm of life. The endless wandering started to soften. Instead of chasing food across vast lands, people began to experiment with staying in one place a little longer. The first shelters became sturdier, built with thought and care, not just as temporary coverings. Fires were kept alive in the same hearths, and tools were left in places to be used again. The world began to feel a little more permanent, as if the earth itself was inviting them to stay. Families planted seeds, waited, and watched them grow. Slowly, the harvest came, and it meant food could be stored, not just eaten immediately. The idea of tomorrow became less frightening because tomorrow might hold bread or grain waiting in baskets. Becoming settlers did not erase the old skills. Hunting and gathering were still important, but the balance shifted. The land was no longer only a place to pass through, but also a partner to live with. Rivers became not just paths to follow, but sources of water for fields. Forests became not just hunting grounds, but also providers of wood for building. The seasons, once only markers of when to move, became cycles of planting and harvesting. People began to live with the land instead of only chasing what it could give. This new way of life changed everything about how groups worked together. Settling meant staying near neighbors, and neighbors meant larger communities. Cooperation grew beyond families to include many families, many hands working on the same soil, many voices sharing the same fires. With stability came the chance to think beyond the day's survival. Time could be spent on shaping better tools, on building stronger shelters, on decorating objects with beauty instead of only necessity. Settling allowed imagination to stretch further, because the constant fear of moving was not always pressing down on them. The rise from wandering to settling was not quick or easy. It was a long process filled with experiments, mistakes, and new ideas. But once the seed of this change was planted, it grew into a transformation that shaped everything that followed. The story of becoming settlers is the story of choosing to stop, to trust the earth, to build roots in one place instead of always chasing the horizon. When people first began to notice the secret power hidden inside tiny seeds, it must have felt like discovering a kind of magic. They saw how a small grain that fell into the soil could, with time and rain, turn into a tall plant full of food. It was different from hunting an animal or finding fruit that appeared and then disappeared with the seasons. This was something people could guide with their own hands, something that seemed to promise a future where food might not only be found but made. Step by step, the idea of farming was born, and with it, a new way of life began to take shape. At first, it was probably very simple. People dropped seeds near their shelters and later found plants growing there. They realized that if they cleared a bit of ground, planted more seeds, and kept the soil free of weeds, the results were bigger and more reliable. Farming became less of an accident and more of a choice, and that choice opened the door to staying in one place for longer periods. Fields began to replace the endless wandering, and people learned to care for the earth as they cared for each other. As farming grew, so did the skills needed to make it successful. People invented digging sticks, hoes, and later plows to turn the soil. They figured out when to plant and when to harvest by watching the sun, the stars, and the patterns of the seasons. They noticed how rivers flooded and left behind rich soil, and they began to plan their fields near those waters. Some learned how to dig channels to bring water to the crops, creating the first irrigation systems. Farming was not easy, but it gave a sense of control over nature that had never been felt before. The promise of food that could be stored changed everything about daily life. Grains like wheat, rice, and barley could be harvested, dried, and kept in baskets or jars for many months. Instead of worrying every day about where the next meal would come from, families could plan for the future. Stored food meant safety during hard seasons, during storms, and even during years when harvests were smaller. With food stored away, people felt more secure, and security gave them the freedom to think, create, and build in new ways. Farming also brought people closer together. One family alone could not always clear fields, plant crops, and protect them from animals. Neighbors began to help each other, and soon groups of families formed larger communities centered around shared land and shared work. Villages appeared, with houses made of mud, wood, or stone standing side by side. The hearth of each home glowed with the same fire, but outside there was now a larger fire, the spirit of the community itself. Living in villages meant children had more friends, elders could share wisdom with more listeners, and celebrations could be enjoyed with music, food, and laughter that echoed beyond a single family. The rhythm of life in these villages became linked to the rhythm of farming. Planting season, growing season, harvest season. These cycles replaced the wandering footsteps of the past. People rose early to work in fields, came home at dusk to share meals, and gathered together to plan for the future. They built storage pits and granaries to protect their harvests. They created stronger shelters, knowing they would not abandon them after a few weeks. Even the way they marked time changed, with calendars and festivals connected to the work of farming. Animals, too, became part of this new world. Instead of chasing wild herds across the land, people began to keep animals near their villages. Goats, sheep, and cattle provided milk, meat, hides, and wool. Dogs helped guard fields, and later oxen pulled plows, making the soil easier to work. Farming and herding worked together, weaving plants and animals into the fabric of human life in a way that wandering had never allowed. Villages were not only about survival, but also about culture. With food more secure, people had more time to shape clay into pots, to weave baskets, to paint walls, and to carve symbols into stone. They could experiment with building stronger houses and decorating them. They could sing, tell stories, and pass down traditions that grew richer with each generation. Farming provided not only food, but also the time and stability for creativity to blossom. Trade began to flourish as villages grew. A family with more grain could trade with another that raised more goats. Tools, pottery, and woven goods moved between households and eventually between villages. These exchanges carried ideas as well as goods, spreading knowledge of farming methods, tools, and even new crops. Villages did not live in isolation, but became connected through networks of exchange that stretched farther and farther. The spark of farming lit a path that spread across the world in many different forms. In some places, rice paddies covered valleys, shining like mirrors in the sun. In others, maize grew tall and rose, or barley and wheat waved like golden seas. Every region shaped farming in its own way, but the result was the same. Food became more predictable, and villages became the heart of human life. When villages began to grow larger, something new started to appear, something beyond farming and herding. People who lived close together for many seasons discovered that life was not only about survival, but also about expression, memory, and exchange. From these crowded places came the beginnings of civilizations, and with them rose the colorful gifts of stories, art, and trade that carried human imagination far beyond the fields. Stories were among the first treasures of these civilizations. In the evenings after work in the fields or markets was done, families and neighbors would gather and voices would rise. Some stories were about the ancestors, telling how they crossed rivers, climbed mountains, and tamed the land. Others were about spirits, gods, and heroes, shaped from wonder at the stars above or the mysteries of storms and seasons. These tales were not just for entertainment. They taught lessons, explained the unknown, and bound people together with shared beliefs. Children learned who they were through stories, and grown-ups found meaning and courage in them. Over time, the spoken tales were carved into symbols, scratched on clay tablets, painted on walls, and written on scrolls. Writing was born, turning memory into something that could last across generations and across lands. Alongside stories grew the beauty of art. At first, it was simple decoration, patterns on pottery, beads strung together, shapes etched into stone. But as people found more time and skill, art expanded into sculptures, murals, jewelry, and woven cloth with dazzling designs. Civilizations expressed their spirit through temples covered in carvings, statues of leaders and gods, and paintings that showed the rhythm of daily life. Art spoke when words could not, showing love, pride, faith, and sorrow in ways everyone could understand. Even the tools of farming and trade became decorated, because beauty was not separate from life but part of it. Every object could hold a story, every wall could carry a message, and every hand could shape meaning out of clay, wood, or metal. Music and dance joined the art of images. Drums beat rhythms in gatherings, flutes carried soft notes into the air, and songs told stories in a way that could be remembered without writing. Festivals were marked by music, dances circled around fires, and voices rose together in chants. These sounds and movements lifted hearts, built unity, and gave civilizations a language of emotion that crossed borders. Where words ended, melodies continued, and they echoed through streets, temples, and open fields. Trade gave civilizations a wider horizon. What one village or city produced was not always enough, but another might have what was missing. Surplus grain could be exchanged for salt, tools for cloth, pottery for precious stones. At riverbanks, crossroads, and harbors, people gathered to swap goods, and in doing so, they also swapped ideas. A new farming technique could travel hundreds of miles through trade routes, just as easily as a jar of honey or a piece of jewelry. Civilizations were never closed worlds. They breathed in the gifts of distant lands and breathed out their own creations in return. Markets became the beating heart of cities. Stalls overflowed with spices, fabrics, metals, and foods. The air was filled with the sound of bargaining voices, the clatter of coins, and the laughter of children weaving between the crowd. Strangers met and became friends. Travelers carried tales of faraway places, and news spread quickly through the lively streets. Trade was not only about wealth, but also about connection, linking villages and cities into networks that stretched across deserts, mountains, and seas. Civilizations also built places to hold these growing treasures. Libraries rose to protect collections of written words. Temples and palaces held murals and statues that celebrated gods and rulers. Markets expanded into vast centers where caravans arrived from far off lands. Roads were laid out, ships were built stronger, and bridges crossed rivers, all to carry the lifeblood of trade and culture. In this way, civilizations grew like living beings, with stories as their memory, art as their soul, and trade as their pulse. The growth of civilizations changed how people saw themselves. No longer just farmers or herders, they became storytellers, artists, merchants, builders, and thinkers. A person could carve a symbol that would be read by someone yet unborn, shape a statue that would stand for centuries, or trade an object that would travel farther than their own feet ever could. Life became layered with meaning, woven from the threads of survival and creativity together. Civilizations also carried dreams of greatness through their stories, art, and trade. Legends inspired courage, monuments showed pride, and bustling markets proved the strength of cooperation. Every new invention, from the potter's wheel to the sail, was a spark that pushed human life further forward. In these crowded, busy centers of human activity, imagination no longer lived quietly in the mind of one person, but became the shared heritage of many, passed from hand to hand, from heart to heart, and from place to place. As civilizations grew stronger and more organized, people began to look beyond the daily needs of food and shelter. Once there was enough stability to support communities, imagination began to stretch higher and wider than ever before. Dreams no longer stayed only in stories told by the fire or pictures painted on walls. They took form in stone, brick, wood, and clay. They took shape in numbers, words, and ideas. Dreams became visible in monuments that reached to the sky and in knowledge that reached into the depths of the human mind. Monuments rose as symbols of what people believed, hoped, and valued. Great walls were built to protect cities, not only from danger, but also as proof of strength. Towers and temples were designed to touch the heavens, reflecting faith in powers greater than the people themselves. Pyramids climbed toward the sun, Palaces sprawled with endless halls, and statues of kings and gods stood taller than any single person. These structures were not only practical or beautiful, they were dreams carved into reality, made to last longer than the lives of those who built them. When people looked at these monuments, they saw their community's story, written in stone for all to witness. The building of monuments required more than just physical strength. It required planning, mathematics, and organization. Architects and engineers began to calculate how to lift heavy stones, how to balance weight, how to design arches and columns that would not collapse. Builders experimented with materials, stone, mud brick, metals, and discovered new techniques to make their work stronger and grander. Knowledge of geometry, measurement, and design grew alongside the monuments because dreams demanded precision. The larger the dream, the greater the need for knowledge to achieve it. Knowledge itself became a monument, one that did not rise in stone but in minds and on tablets, scrolls, and books. People studied the stars and mapped the movements of the sun, moon, and planets. They learned how to predict floods and seasons, how to track time, and how to create calendars that guided farmers and priests alike. They recorded laws to govern life fairly, created alphabets and languages to preserve their words, and developed numbers and systems to measure trade, land, and wealth. Knowledge was not only a tool for survival, but also a way to answer the eternal questions that filled human hearts. Dreams of understanding the world shaped schools, libraries, and centers of learning. In some civilizations, great collections of writings were gathered, holding everything from myths to medical knowledge, from poetry to astronomy. Scholars devoted their lives to reading, copying, and teaching, passing wisdom from one generation to the next. Students gathered to listen to philosophers who asked questions about life, justice, and the universe itself. Knowledge became something to be shared, to be debated, and to be expanded. And through this, the human mind stretched beyond what had ever been imagined. Monuments and knowledge were closely connected. One inspired the other, and both reflected the dreams of their creators. To build a temple required mathematics, but it also inspired art, music, and rituals that filled people with wonder. To design a library required architecture, but it also encouraged writing, reading, and preserving the wisdom of the past. Dreams of greatness in stone could not exist without knowledge, and dreams of understanding the world could not spread without monuments that housed them. Together, they formed the twin pillars of civilization's rise. These achievements also carried meaning beyond their physical or intellectual form. Monuments showed a people's identity, reminding them of who they were and what they valued. Knowledge showed a people's curiosity, proving that their minds were never satisfied with what they already knew. Both served as bridges across time. Long after a builder or a thinker was gone, their dream remained. A temple could still inspire awe. A law written on stone could still guide behavior. A story inscribed on a scroll could still teach wisdom. Dreams gave civilizations the power to outlive the lives of individuals and to continue shaping the future. Dreams of monuments and knowledge also traveled across lands. Travelers who saw great pyramids or towering statues carried tales of them back home. Merchants who traded scrolls and books spread ideas as well as goods. Scholars who visited faraway cities brought new mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy to their own people. The dreams of one civilization did not stay locked inside its walls but spread, mixing with the dreams of others, creating a shared human heritage that grew richer with every exchange. The ambition to dream bigger did not always bring peace. Monuments sometimes reflected the power of rulers who demanded labor and resources, while knowledge sometimes created conflicts between beliefs and discoveries. Yet, even in these struggles, the desire to build and to know never faded. Civilizations rose and fell, but the dreams they shaped in stone and thought remained as reminders that human imagination does not disappear. Every new generation looked at what came before and tried to reach further, to build higher, to think deeper. The story that began with wandering feet, with seeds planted in the soil, with stories whispered by the fire and monuments carved in stone, has never really stopped. Every step of the past leads directly into the present, and everything we see around us is part of that same long journey. The cities we live in, the languages we speak, the tools we hold in our hands, even the way we share our thoughts with one another, are all threads woven into the fabric that began long ago. The story continues with us today, and every single person alive is still a character in this great unfolding tale. When I look at the world now, I can see echoes of those first villages and civilizations everywhere. Streets crowded with cars are not so different from the markets where people once gathered to trade grain for cloth. Skyscrapers stretching into the sky are not so different from the ancient temples that reached upward to touch the heavens. Libraries filled with millions of books are not so different from the first clay tablets, carefully pressed with symbols to hold memory. The tools have changed, the scale has grown, but the heart of the story is the same. People coming together to create something larger than themselves. Technology has become the modern monument. Instead of carving stone blocks or stacking bricks, we shape glass, metal, and light into machines that can carry us across oceans, speak to us from tiny screens, and even explore beyond the Earth itself. The dream of understanding the stars that began with watchers lying under the night sky has led to rockets soaring into space and telescopes, capturing images of galaxies far away. The dream of preserving stories that began with spoken tales has grown into digital libraries where knowledge is stored in invisible code and shared instantly across the world. Every invention we hold today is the continuation of the same desire to dream, to know, and to build. Knowledge has grown wider than the earliest thinkers could ever imagine. Questions about medicine, the body, and the earth that once puzzled civilizations are now studied in laboratories filled with microscopes and computers. Mysteries about numbers and shapes that once guided builders of pyramids now form the basis of complex sciences that allow us to send messages through invisible signals or cure diseases with powerful treatments. But even with all this, the spirit of curiosity remains the same. Just like the earliest scholars gazing at the sky or philosophers asking questions about life, people today still wonder, still seek, still search for answers to mysteries that have not yet been solved. The story also continues in the way we connect with one another. Trade routes of the past have turned into global networks, where ideas and goods move faster than ever before. A person in one corner of the world can share a song, a design, or piece of knowledge with someone thousands of miles away in just seconds. Cultures mix and influence each other just as they did when merchants carried silk or spices across deserts. Only now the exchange is instant and constant. What once took months of travel by foot or by ship can now happen with the click of a button, but the meaning is the same, people reaching beyond their own borders to share and to learn. Art and stories, too, continue to bloom. The walls of caves once painted with animals have grown into theaters, books, films, and music that can reach billions. Just as ancient civilizations filled their temples with carvings and songs, we fill our lives with images on screens, melodies through headphones, and stories told in every possible way. The need to express, to imagine, and to create beauty remains as powerful as it was thousands of years ago. Every painting, every poem, every piece of music written today adds another layer to the long tradition that began when the first person sang by the fire or etched a symbol into stone. The challenges we face today are also part of the story. Just as early farmers worried about harvests, we worry about food for growing populations. Just as ancient builders struggled with floods or earthquakes, we deal with storms, climate, and natural forces that remind us of our connection to the earth. Just as civilizations once debated how to live together in fairness, we debate laws, rights, and justice. The questions may appear larger now, but they are still the same questions that have guided people since the beginning. How do we survive? How do we thrive? How do we live together in peace? The story is not only about what has been built, but about what is still possible. Each generation inherits not just the monuments and knowledge of the past, but also the responsibility to carry them forward. Children who learn today will create the discoveries of tomorrow, just as the children of ancient times grew into the builders of temples and the writers of laws. Every choice, every invention, every dream adds another page to the book of humanity, a book that is never finished but always being written.